Chapter 4 of Slavery. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. The liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in commonwealth, nor under the domain of any will or restraint of any law, but what legislative shall enact according to the trust put in it. So, naturally, according to the law of nature and in the state of nature, a man is not under the control of any other being. A man is free at liberty and at his own choice to do whatever he wants to. Okay, but then comes one little thing, that is when people come together to establish a commonwealth like a republic, and then that is when they put some power into that republic to follow its rule. Okay, so that they are under the legislative power of that commonwealth, that whoever does wrong gets punished by the commonwealth, by the consent of the commonwealth. And this is what is happening with all the governments today. We are free, we have all the freedom with us, but we have given some part of our freedom to the government to, in a way, rule upon us, so that to keep in check that everybody is equal. So, by the law of nature, everybody is free. No man has any superior power over the other person, or nobody on earth. Freedom, then, is not what Sir Robert Filmer tells us, a liberty for everyone to do what he lists, to live as he pleases, and not to be tied by any laws. So, according to Sir Robert Filmer, freedom is something like this, to do whatever you want to, and there is no law that will keep a check upon you or will stop you from doing anything. So, that is not the correct definition of freedom today. And in no matter what circumstance we say, no matter how we play out, I think the majority of times, if you look at statistically, the majority of times there will be a formation of a commonwealth or a republic that will be needed to govern all people together. Okay, so that is not what liberty and freedom is, what Sir Robert Filmer tells us. But freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society and made by the legislative power erected in it. So there is a legislative power in the laws and the rules that is made by that commonwealth, by the governing body, by the government, whatever you want to name it. And that is such a rule that everybody has to abide by it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things where that rule prescribes not to be subject to the inconstant, constant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature. So, any other area where there is no jurisdiction of the Commonwealth, where the Commonwealth or the Republic or the government that is formed does not have an area to look upon, or where the people have not consented to form a Commonwealth, in that case, a man is completely free, and only the law of nature is the one that he needs to abide by. This freedom from absolute arbitrary power is so necessary and closely joined with a man's preservation that he cannot part with it but by what forfeits its preservation and life together. For a man not having the power of his own life cannot by compact or his own consent enslave himself to anyone, nor put himself under the absolute arbitrary power of another to take away his life when he pleases. So this freedom, okay, from absolute arbitrary power, that is, there is no superior authority or superior power over another man, whether it's a thing, whether it's another human being, there is no such power. It's very important for a man's preservation, for preservation of life together, everything. It's very important. And a man not having the power of his own life cannot, by compact or his consent, enslave himself to anyone. So, when we are talking about slavery, of course, the conditions in which people are enslaved. For example, what are the different conditions in which people are enslaved? That is mostly a condition of war or a situation of some extreme circumstance wherein there is an extreme threat to life, or there is an extreme need of survival. In those cases, men enslave themselves or become slave to another person. So now, a man who does not have the power over his own life, for example, there is somebody with a gun on your head and then asking you to do certain things, asking you to be a slave of them, and you agree to it that okay, I'm ready to be your slave. Now in that case, you did not have the power over your own life, and a simple answer such as no would just take away your life. That means you do not have control over your own life when you die, when you live. It was in the control of another man. And in that case, you when you enslave yourself to somebody, that is technically a wrong situation. That slavery is not correct. In situations when, you know, okay, you're in need of money, you need some work to do, you need some for some any other purpose, you need to learn something for whatever xyz reason. For such that reason, if you enslave yourself that okay, I'm ready to be a slave, that is a very different situation. And in those cases, slavery is right. But when you don't have the power over your own life is when slavery is not right, and you cannot enslave yourself to anybody in such conditions. Nobody can give more power than he has himself, and he that cannot take away his own life cannot give another power over it. So now, of course, this is something that we've been discussing, that nobody can have more power than you yourself upon yourself. And also, he cannot, in those circumstances, I'm quoting here, in those circumstances when, of course, he does not have power over his own life, he cannot give his own life or enslave himself to anybody because he himself doesn't have the power over it. He himself doesn't have the power over his own life. So in such a case, how can it's the same thing. It's your friend's pencil kept on the table and somebody asks for the pencil, that okay, I want this pencil. Now technically you cannot give away the pencil because it's not yours to give. In the same way, in situations where one does not have power over their own life, in those cases they cannot really enslave themselves to somebody because it's not their property anymore, or they don't have a power over it. Indeed, having by his fault forfeited his own life by some act that deserves death, he to whom he has forfeited it may, when he has him in his power, delay to take it, and make use of him to his own service, and he does him no injury by it. For whenever he finds the hardship of his slavery outweigh the value of his life, it is in his power, by resisting the will of his master, to draw on himself the death he desires. Now, in cases where he himself has done something that deserves death, or he himself has done some punishment, in such cases when he enslaves himself, that is a very different situation, because that is a kind of a punishment, not a threat to life. And in cases also, now in slavery, in cases of slavery, like you are a slave and you think that now you cannot really bear that slavery upon you, the hardships of that slavery, so that is when you have the power to draw yourself a death that you desire. Okay, now why this point is important is because earlier we discussed that death cannot be by your own will. It is the will of the Master, the Lord, to draw death upon you, because we are his property and we live according to his pleasure. But in conditions of slavery, now these circumstances are different when you're a slave to somebody and you have become a slave because you do not really have power over your own life. In such cases, you can die whenever you want because you're not able to bear the hardship of that slavery upon you. This is the perfect condition of slavery, which is nothing else but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. For if one's compact enter between them and make an agreement for a limited power on the one side and obedience on the other, the state of war and slavery ceases as long as the compact endures. For as has been said, no man can by agreement pass over to another what that which he had not in himself a power over his own life. Now, when we talk about slavery, slavery is a continued condition of the state of war. Now, the state of war is also a part of this Jean Locke's two treatises of government, which is not in your syllabus, so we did not really discuss it. But of slavery is basically a continuation of a state of war, because mostly slaves are encapsulated after the state of war. Okay, so now there is we need to understand this. It's a very technical thing, it's a very simple thing, but there's a very minor difference, and the difference is important. Now, until and unless you are enslaved against your consent, you don't want it. Till that time, the state of war continues. But the moment you agree to be slave, you agree to, you enter into an agreement, into a contract with your conqueror that, okay, I'm ready to enslave you, don't kill me, and give me food and this and that. From that moment on, the state of slavery and the state of war end, and then it is nothing but just an agreement between two people. It will be just your profession from then on. So the state of slavery will only mean till the time that you yourself willfully have not consented to that kind of a relationship with your master, to that, the relationship of being you know a professional servant to the master. Because from then on you won't be a slave, you will be a servant. And there's a difference between a slave and a servant. A servant will serve you because of his own will. He'll see it as a profession, but a slave is somebody who has been encapsulated against his or her own will. So you see that the state of war and slavery will continue only till the point of time where you are not in agreement, or you don't agree with being that slave. The moment you do that, then you're no longer a slave. Just take an example here. We know about so many women who were raided from the other side of the religion, and they were taken and then they were married off and stuff like that. Now, till the moment that the woman still has to live by the fear of the family and has no will according to her own, she's just living for the sake of living, for to save her life, she will be a slave. Okay, we're talking about the partition times. The partition times when the women from the other side of the religion were abducted and married off. But the moment, after crossing the border, after living some time, it happened so gradually that the women started accepting themselves as a part of the family, and then started behaving as a member of the family, and, by their own will, became a member of the family. So like they were no longer in, means they themselves started taking part in the matters of the family, and they find it was like a sacrifice, a compromise that they made, that okay, now nothing can be done, we have been married off, we are a part of the family, nobody will come to take us, so we will fully enter into this agreement, we will fully enter into this marriage, and then become a part of the family and live our life as a member of this family. So that when that happened, that was the moment that the condition of slavery ended. It was no longer a slavery, but just an agreement, or whatever you call it. Okay? I confess, we find among the Jews as well as other Indians that men didn't sell themselves, but it is plain this was only to drudgery, not to slavery, for it is evident that person sold was not under an absolute, arbitrary, despotical power, for the master could not have power to kill him at any time, whom at a certain time he was obliged to let go free out of his service. And the master of such a servant was so far from having an arbitrary power of his life that he could not as pleasure so much as maim him, but the loss of an eye or tooth set him free. So it so happened that this is something that we find among Jews and also other nations, even I think in France, England, this so happened that people would sell themselves. They were in dire need of money, their family. So what they would do is they would sell themselves. People would buy them, and then with their money, they would give it to their family, their, husband, wife, whoever is selling, the children, the parents. They will give them the money. Okay, so the family will have some money with them, they can start anything with it, or at least something, and the person who has sold himself or herself will go on with the master. So at that time, that is again not a slavery, because somewhere that is willful, and just now there were a lot of conditions attached with it, of that slavery. So if you have time, if you're interested in it, do read what are the different kinds of slavery that were performed throughout the globe all these times. There were so many of them. There were conditions like if a slave somewhere, for example, lost his arm, tooth, any part of the body, he has to be set free. And for example, in the cases of marriage, if the slave wants to marry, what are the different conditions for it, what are the different situations that can spring out of it, whether the slave can live with the master anymore or not, and all that stuff. So there are so many different conditions. If you're interested, you can always go on and read it. Of the beginning of political societies. So now, of course, political societies began when men came together, formed a community, and consented to form a commonwealth by the will of the majority to have a rule over them, to have an upper hand over them, so that equality and freedom prevails all throughout. Men, being as has been said, in nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of his estate and subjected to political power of another without his own consent, which is done by agreeing with other men to join and unite into one community for their comfort, able, safe, and peaceable living, one amongst another in a secure enjoyment of their properties and a greater security against that or any of it. This and any number of men may do, because it injures not the freedom of the rest, they are left as they were in liberty of the state of nature. When any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, then they are presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. So when this thing happens, when you form a political society, when you form a body of commonwealth, that is when somewhere your freedom is entailed to some degree, because you're giving some power to that body to have control over you. For when any number of men have, by the consent of every individual, made a community, they have thereby made that community one body with the power to act as one body, which is only by the will and determination of the majority. For that which acts in a community being only the consent of the individuals of it, and it being one body must move away, it is necessary the body should move the way whither the greater force carries, which is the consent of the majority, or else it is impossible it should act or continue one body, one community, which the consent of every individual that united into it agreed that it should. And so everyone is bound by that consent to be concluded by the majority. And therefore, we see that in assemblies empowered to act by positive laws, where no number is set by that positive law which empowers them, the act of the majority passes for the act of the whole, and of course determines as having by the law of nature and reason the power of the whole. So in very simple words and terms, what Locke is trying to tell us is that when now, okay, you've agreed to form a community, agreed to form a commonwealth, now in that case it is not really possible to go by the wish of every individual every time a decision is being made. So in a commonwealth, of course, the decision will go with the greater force, not the minority, not the individual choice, but the greater force, the majority, or with the choice that the majority agree with, will is the direction that the decision goes to. And it is impossible, if we go by the choice of every individual, it is impossible to continue with the community as one single body, because it's not possible. Two individuals can have so contrasting views that it's not possible to go by both of them. So of course the decision making will go according or in the flow of the greater force where the majority is going. And thus, every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to everyone of that society to submit to the determination of the majority and to be concluded by it, or else this original compact, whereby he with others incorporates into one society, would signify nothing and be no compact if he be left free under no other ties than he was in before in the state of nature. So when you agree and consent to be a part of that union, to be part of that community, you put yourself under an obligation. You put yourself under the rule of law and the law of the government besides the law of nature. Because if that doesn't happen, if you're no longer following the rule of, okay, you say that you're part of the union, you're part of the community, but you're not following the law that has been made that that particular body or the government, then it's no different than being in the state of nature. Then you just man, you can no longer be counted as part of that body or the community. So you agree to it, and you have an obligation, you have a duty to follow and stand by every rule of that government after it, because it has been decided by the rule of majority. For what appearance would there be of any compact, what new engagement, if he were no farther tied by any decrees of society than he himself thought fit and did actually consent to? This would be still as a great liberty as he himself had it before his compact, or anyone else in the state of nature who may submit himself and consent to any acts of it if he thinks fit. So if even after forming the government the person is doing just whatever he wants to, then it's no different. Then what is the point of making that government? For if the consent of the majority shall not in reason be received as the act of the whole, and conclude every individual, nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything to be the act of the whole, which, considering the infirmities of health and avocations of business, which in number, though much less than that of a commonwealth, will necessarily keep many away from the public assembly, and the variety of opinions and contrariety of interests which unavoidably happen in all collections of men, it is next impossible ever to be had. So, if you do not agree with the majority, if you do not go with the decision of the majority, then it's not really possible to go on with any decision, because the decision of every individual, if we go by, is not possible. Okay. And therefore, if coming into society be upon such terms, it will be only like Catos coming into the theatre, Talium would exert. Such a constitution as this would make the mighty Leviathan of a shorter duration than the feeblest creatures and not let it outlast the day it was born in, which cannot be supposed till we can think that rational creatures should desire and constitute societies only to be dissolved. For where the majority cannot conclude the rest, there they cannot act as one body and consequently will be immediately dissolved again. So if nobody goes by the rule of majority, everybody thinks that what I'm thinking should only be done, then of course that government, that body that has been constituted, will be dissolved as soon as it is formed. Because again, the point is the same. The choice of every individual cannot be followed, so we will have to go by the rule of majority. And if we do not agree by the rule of the majority, where the greater force is moving, and every time we think that the government will do whatever every single person thinks, then the government will be dissolved definitely. It's not possible to continue with that body anymore. Whosoever, therefore, out of state of nature unite into community must be understood to give up all the power necessary to ends for which they unite into society. So we are expected, and we need to give up the power we hold in the state of nature, because we are entering into community, so we are bound by some kind of rule together unless they expressly agree in a number greater than the majority. And this is done by barely agreeing to unite into one political society, which is all the compact that is or needs be between the individuals that enter into or make up a commonwealth. And thus, that which begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of freemen capable of majority to unite and incorporate into such a society. And this is what that only which did or could give beginning to any lawful government in the world. So the only possible beginning to any lawful government will be where any number of freemen, that it could be 10, 20,000, 10,000 lakh, 10 lakh crores, any number of freemen consent to unite into one single body, one single government. Only then, when they consent to it, they come into contact, they form a community, can any lawful government be formed. Other than that, there is no other possible way if they don't agree to majority. They have to agree to give up some part of their freedom, they have to agree to be a one single body, they have to agree to go by the rule of majority further on, and they have to agree themselves to be a part of that government, to come under the obligation of that government. Only then will any lawful government be formed. Other than that, it's not possible to form a government, to form a body. It will just collapse. To this I find two objections made. First, that there are no instances to be found in story of a company of man, independent and equal amongst one another, that met together and this way began and set up a government. It is impossible of right that men should do so, because all men being born under government, they are to submit to that and not at liberty to begin a new one. Okay, now there are two things. First, there are not really any instances found in the story, matlab, throughout history, that we see that okay, all people coming together agreeing to form a government. We see that somewhere or the other by force have some person has established themselves as a chief or the leader, and then of course people have started following it. And the second objection that Locke points out is, now what about the people that are born into that union? They have not agreed to be a part of that union. Of course, this question must have popped into your head, that we were born in it, we didn't have a choice. What should we do then? Do we submit to the authority of the government that we are already living, or can we begin a new one? Do we start a new one, because we were born into it? It was not really our choice that we formed the government or became a part of the government. To the first, there is this to answer, that it is not at all to be wondered that what history gave us but a very little account of men that I live together in the state of nature. The inconveniences of that condition and the love and want of society no sooner brought any number of them together, but they presently united and incorporated with the design to continue together. And if we may not suppose men ever to have in the state of nature, because we hear not so much of them in such a state, as well as suppose the armies of Salamander or Circes were never children, because we hear little of them till they were men and embodied in armies. Government is everywhere antecedent to records, and letters seldom come in amongst people till a long continuation of civil society has by any other more necessary parts provided for their safety, ease, and plenty, and then they begin to look after the history of their founders and search into their original when they have outlived the memory of it. So the first one, when we talk about that, okay, what about them? We don't really hear the people coming together, forming a government and all that thing. But to this Locke answers that at the point of time when even the first of these societies were formed, situations were very inconvenient. There were not really proper food, proper shelter, proper living facilities, and not really advancement in technology to that level. And then there was a love, or there was a need for society. People were like practically asking for it. So in those cases, when the society, political societies were formed, even by the consent of only a few people, and or the force of the other leader, then in some case it is, it has been accepted by the majority of people. Government is everywhere antecedent, okay, and they begin to look after the history of their founders and search into their original when they have outlived the memory of it. For it is with commonwealths as with particular person, they are commonly ignorant of their own words and infancies, and if they know anything of it, they are beholding for it to the accidental records that others have kept of it. So of course, another thing that he points to is that we don't really have the proper records for it, okay, and those that we have of the beginning of any polities in the world excepting that of the Jews, where God himself immediately interposed, and which favors not at all paternal dominion, are all either plain instances of such a beginnings as I have mentioned, or at least have manifest footsteps of it. So somewhere we see some footsteps of those political societies being formed, by, okay, maybe by the consent of a fewer number of people, that at the present time, okay, only some people forming it, and then they taking control over it. But then the situations were different then. There were inconveniences at that time, and that is why, that thing continued. People, somewhere or the other, people agreed to be a part of that union. He must show a strange inclination to deny evident matter of fact when it agrees not with the hypothesis, who will not allow that the beginning of Rome and Venice were by the uniting together of several men, free and independent one of another, amongst whom there was no natural superiority or subjection. And if Joseph Acosta's word may be taken, he tells us that in many parts of America there was no government at all. There are great and apparent conjectures, says he, that these men for a long time had neither kings nor commonwealths, but lived in troops, as they do this day in Florida and Chiriquanas, those of Brazil, and many other nations which have no certain kings, but as occasion is offered in peace or war, they choose their captains as they please. So in Rome and Venice, this thing happened that, a number of men who were free, who were in the state of nature, under the law of nature, they came together and then formed a union, formed a republic, formed a commonwealth. And that is how somewhere in Rome and Venice it is said to be formed. It is said to be the start of the government there. But in America, there was no commonwealth for a long time. There were no leaders, they were all equal. Until date, Florida and Chiriquanas are the places where people live like that. But only in times of war, what happened was there was a captain chosen, and then the person led the whole troop or the group. So, of course, this is a different kind of a commonwealth, this is a different kind of a government. If it is said that every man there was born subject to his father, or the head of his family, that the subjection due to from a child to a father took away not his freedom or of uniting into what political society he thought fit, has been already proved. But be that as it will, these men, it is evident, were actually free, and whatever superiority some politicians now would place in any of them, they themselves claimed it or not, but by consent were all equal, till by the same consent they set rulers over themselves. And if we point to the second objection, that some people may say that, okay, a child who is born to a person, to a father, is, the child is subject to that father, so the child will do whatever the father pleases him to be do, and that child was not really free, or did not really choose the government for himself. But then that is not actually true. The child was free. The child has all the powers to free and enter into any government he or she thought so. But by giving consent to the government, he himself, it was his own choice to give consent to the government and be a part of that government, and then set himself under the rulers. So when we say that, anybody born into the government, not really his choice, that's not actually true. Every person has at some point of time, or at every point of time, had his own will, to be a part of that government. He had the choice, and he chose to be under the government. So that their politic societies all began from a voluntary union and the mutual agreement of men freely acting in the choice of the governments and forms of government. And so somewhere we see that, okay, somewhere everything was born out of the union. And I hope those who went away from Sparta with Palantis mentioned by Justin will be allowed to have freemen independent one of another, and to have set up a government over themselves by their own consent. Thus, I have given several examples out of history of people free and in the state of nature, that being met together incorporated began a commonwealth. And if we want of such instances be an argument to prove that government were not nor could be so begin, I suppose the contenders for paternal empire were better let it alone than urge it against natural liberty. For if they can give so many instances out of history of governments begin upon paternal right, I think one might without any greater danger yield them the cause. So now Locke is saying that he has given all so many examples of how the Commonwealth have somewhere or the other started by the voluntary union of the number of people. Like in the case of America, where it was a little different, they may not have formed a Commonwealth, but in the cases of war, they decided for a captain for themselves, and that is how somewhere the idea of the government in America started. The form of government there started. So somewhere or the other, whenever there is a commonwealth found of any sort, it has been by the voluntary union of people somewhere or the other, not in all cases, not in every case, but generally we may say so. But if I might advise them in the case, they would do well not to search too much to the original of governments as they have begun de facto, lest they should find at the foundation of most of them something very little favorable to the design they promote and such a power as they contend for. But to conclude, reason being plain on our side that men are naturally free, and the examples of history showing that the governments of the world that were begin in peace the governments were begun in peace by the voluntary unions somewhere or the other, had their beginning laid on that foundation, and were made by the consent of the people. There can be little room for doubt either where the right is or what has been the opinion or practice of mankind about the first erecting of governments. You only have this much in syllabus. After 104, you don't have it in your syllabus from 105. So we are done with this part of sociopol philosophy. See you in the next video.